Okay, so you hear about keratoconus and how many people it affects, and the numbers are all over the place. Like I've seen everything from 2 people per million all the way up to like almost 48,000 per million. So what gives? Why such a huge range?
Well, that's what we're going to be looking at today. It's a
Exact.
fascinating new study.
Yeah, so this deep dive is all about a study that's trying to figure out why those numbers are so different.
And they're using a really interesting approach looking at climate data from around the world to see if there are any connections.
Yeah, planet-wide analysis.
Yeah.
But first, for anyone who's not totally up on keratoconus, basically it's when the cornea, the front part of your eye, it thins out and bulges outwards.
Yeah.
And that can really mess with your vision, makes things blurry and hard to see. So the study we're looking at is called Climate Determinants of Keratoconus, Insights from a Systematic Review of Prevalence. It came out in February 2025. And get this, one of the big findings is that humidity, not UV like a lot of people think, is strongly linked to keratoconus.
Yeah, and the researchers really went all out on this. They didn't just like check the weather app or something. They analyzed data from 11 studies covering 61 different areas around the world.
60, wow.
And they used these really sophisticated climate data sets to make sure they were getting the most accurate weather averages for each of those regions.
Okay, so 61 areas, that's a pretty wide scope. But did they just use like a basic average for the climate in each area? I mean, I'm thinking like even within one region, you could have a lot of variation.
Oh, yeah, you're totally right. And the researchers actually thought of that. They use this cool technique called population weighting. And what that does is it makes sure that the climate data they're using really reflects where people actually live within each region.
Okay, so it's not just a simple average of the whole area.
Exactly.
Gotcha. So can you give us an example of like why that's so important?
Sure, imagine a state like Nevada, right? You've got scorching hot deserts, and then you've got cool mountain areas all within the same state boundaries. So if you just took an average temperature for the whole state, it wouldn't really show what people in those different areas are actually experiencing.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. So they took those variations within each region into account
Yeah.
to try to get a more accurate picture of the climate people are actually exposed to. Okay, so they were careful about the climate data, but did they consider other things that could affect keratoconus besides climate? Like I'm thinking access to healthcare or, economic differences between regions.
Yeah, that's a great point. And they did consider that. They factored in a country's GDP per capita to try to account for those economic differences.
Okay, so they were trying to isolate the role of climate as much as possible. Makes sense. So let's get to that key finding about humidity. They found a negative association between humidity and keratoconus prevalence. Can you explain what that means? Like in plain English, what does negative association actually mean?
Well, basically it means that in areas with higher humidity, the prevalence of keratoconus tends to be lower.
Okay.
And on the flip side, in drier regions, you typically see higher rates of keratoconus.
So if you live in a more humid area, your risk of keratoconus might be lower.
That's what the study suggests.
Interesting. So why would humidity have anything to do with your eyes? It's not like our eyeballs are sponges soaking up moisture from the air.
Right, it's not quite that simple. But our eyes do need moisture to stay healthy. And when the air is dry, our eyes can dry out more easily, which can lead to dry eye disease.
Dry eye.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And dry eye tends to be more common in drier climates.
Right.
And here's the thing. Dry eye has been linked to an increased risk of keratoconus.
Wait, are you saying that dry eyes could lead to keratoconus?
It's not a direct cause and effect. It's more complex than that. But what the study authors suggest is that dry eye could be one of the links in a chain connecting low humidity and keratoconus.
Okay, so it's not just the dry air itself damaging the cornea. It's more like it creates a higher risk for other problems like dry eye, which then might make you more susceptible to keratoconus.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
So it's like a domino effect.
Exactly.
Dry air is the first domino,
Could be.
and then that can set off a chain reaction.
Yep.
Fascinating. So what does this all mean for our listeners? Should we all be running out to buy humidifiers?
Well, hold on a second. It's important to remember that just because two things are linked doesn't mean that one causes the other.
Right. Correlation doesn't equal causation.
Exactly. We need more research to definitively say that low humidity actually causes keratoconus.
Good point. But it still seems like something worth paying attention to, right?
Yeah.
Especially if you live in a drier climate.
Absolutely. I would say so. The link is strong enough that it's definitely worth being aware of. If you live in a dry climate or are concerned about keratoconus risk, talk to your eye doctor about ways to keep your eyes moisturized.
So don't underestimate the power of a good eye drop. But what about other climate factors? We've talked a lot about humidity, but what about things like UV exposure, wind speed, temperature?
Yeah, they looked into those too.
Did they?
Yeah.
And that's where things get even more interesting.
I'm all ears. Spill the tea.
Well, the findings actually challenge some common beliefs about keratoconus. Do you want to take a guess at what they found?
Let me see. I've always heard that too much sun exposure is bad for your eyes, and that it could even increase your risk of keratoconus. Is that what they found?
It's a logical assumption, but surprisingly no. The study found no significant link between UV exposure and keratoconus.
Wow, really?
Yeah.
So maybe all that sunscreen and those stylish sunglasses weren't doing much to prevent keratoconus after all.
Well, protecting your eyes from the sun is still incredibly important for a lot of reasons. Just maybe not so much for keratoconus.
This is blowing my mind. So if UV exposure is off the hook, what about wind speed and temperature?
They were cleared of suspicion, too. No connection to keratoconus. So it seems like humidity really is the main climate factor we need to be thinking about.
That's what the study suggests.
Okay, I want to make sure I'm clear on something. When we talk about prevalence, what exactly are we talking about? Are we talking about, like, the number of new cases of keratoconus each year? Or is it something else?
That's a good question. Prevalence doesn't refer to new cases. It's the total number of people who have keratoconus at a given time, whether they were diagnosed yesterday or years ago.
Gotcha. So they were looking at the overall snapshot of how many people have keratoconus, not just the new cases.
Exactly.
Okay, but how did they collect and compare data from all these different areas? It seems like it would be a huge challenge with different countries and healthcare systems.
Yeah, it's definitely tricky. Ensuring consistency across diverse data sets is always a challenge in these types of studies. They were very careful to only include studies that provided reliable and comparable estimates of clinical keratoconus prevalence.
So they had to be picky about the data they used.
They did.
What kind of studies were they looking for?
They specifically focused on what are called registry-based studies. Those are studies that track patients who need medical attention for keratoconus.
Okay, so they weren't including studies that just screen people for keratoconus, even if those people didn't have any symptoms or need treatment.
Right, because screening studies often pick up on milder cases that might not even be noticeable, and that makes it harder to compare them to studies that are focused on people who are actually seeking medical care.
Right, it's comparing apples to oranges.
Exactly.
So they wanted to make sure they were comparing apples to apples.
Precisely.
Smart approach. It sounds like they really wanted to build their analysis on solid ground. So after all that careful data selection, what did they find in terms of prevalence around the world? Was it pretty uniform, or were there noticeable variations?
Well, the median prevalence of keratoconus across all the regions they studied was 0.10%, meaning that roughly 1 in every 1,000 people had keratoconus. But here's the catch. The range was quite wide. It went from as low as 0.02% to as high as 0.67%.
Wow, that is a big difference. So even though humidity seems to be playing a significant role, there are obviously other factors at play too.
Oh, for sure.
So what else did they uncover?
Well, one thing that really stood out was the geographical patterns they observed.
Oh yeah, like where in the world keratoconus is more or less common.
Exactly. And they actually included a really cool map in their study. It shows humidity levels and keratoconus prevalence across all the different regions they analyzed.
I'm looking at that map right now.
Yeah.
That's pretty striking.
What's really interesting is that areas known for their dry climates, like the Middle East, they also tend to have higher rates of keratoconus.
You can really see it on the map. It's like those drier regions are lighting up.
It is. It's almost like a heat map for keratoconus risk.
Exactly. But, you mentioned earlier that correlation doesn't equal causation. So how can we be sure that it's the dryness itself that's contributing to keratoconus and not just something else that happens to be common in those regions?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. And to be clear, this study doesn't definitively prove that low humidity causes keratoconus.
Right.
It's more like a strong clue that points us in a certain direction.
Okay, so it's a starting point for more research.
Exactly.
So if we entertain this idea that dryness could be a contributing factor, how would that actually work biologically? Like how could dry air affect the cornea in a way that leads to keratoconus?
Well, the researchers discussed a few possible explanations, and it goes back to something we talked about earlier, dry eye disease.
Ah, yes, those poor parched peepers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we know that low humidity is directly associated with an increased risk of dry eye. And as we discussed, dry eye is a known risk factor for keratoconus.
So it's possible that dry air sets off this chain reaction that increases the risk.
That's the thinking.
So it's not just the dry air itself damaging the cornea. It's more like it's setting the stage for other problems, like dry eye,
Right.
which then might increase the likelihood of developing keratoconus. Okay, that makes sense. But wait, isn't dry eye super common? I mean, if dry eye was a major driver of keratoconus, wouldn't we expect to see way more cases of keratoconus?
That's a really good point. And it highlights the fact that while dry eye might be part of the puzzle, it's unlikely to be the whole story. There are probably other factors at play, including genetics that determine whether someone with dry eye will go on to develop keratoconus.
Okay, so it's like having a predisposition,
Mm-hmm.
and then the dry eye might act as a trigger.
Exactly.
It's rarely just one thing, right?
Yep. Right.
It's usually a combination of factors.
Yeah, it's complex.
So did they look at any other potential links in that chain reaction besides dry eye?
They did. They pointed to eczema and ocular allergies, both of which are more common in drier climates, as potential players in this relationship.
Wait, are you telling me that my seasonal allergies could be increasing my risk of keratoconus?
Now, don't panic. It's important to remember that these are just potential links, and we need more research to confirm them.
Okay, deep breaths.
But it does raise the possibility that if you're already genetically predisposed to keratoconus, having those conditions might increase your risk.
Okay, I'll try not to freak out about my allergies. But it does make you wonder if managing those conditions, like keeping allergies under control, could potentially help reduce the risk.
It's definitely worth talking to your eye doctor about. And speaking of things that might influence risk, the researchers also pointed out that low humidity is associated with thinner corneas.
Which is a hallmark of keratoconus.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow, so it's like all these little pieces of evidence are starting to fit together.
Yeah.
I mean, we can't definitively say that low humidity causes keratoconus, but there's mounting evidence to suggest that it's a pretty significant risk factor.
I think that's a fair assessment.
So this is challenging some of my long-held beliefs about keratoconus. Like, I always thought spending too much time in the sun was bad for your eyes, especially when it comes to keratoconus.
Yeah, it's a common belief.
But was that all just a myth?
Well, UV radiation can definitely damage the cornea. But what's interesting is that this study found no significant link between UV exposure and keratoconus prevalence.
So maybe all those years of diligently wearing sunglasses and slathering on sunscreen weren't really doing much to prevent keratoconus.
Well, let me be clear. Protecting your eyes from the sun is always a good idea for lots of reasons.
Right.
It can reduce your risk of other eye conditions.
Yeah, of course.
But this study suggests that UV might not be as big of a factor in keratoconus development as we once thought.
That's a relief. So if UV is off the hook, what about other climate factors like wind speed and temperature?
They were cleared of suspicion, too. No connection to keratoconus.
So it seems like humidity really is the key climate variable.
It does seem that way.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about humidity, but I'm curious, did the researchers find anything else noteworthy in their analysis? Were there any other interesting correlations or unexpected trends?
Well, aside from the humidity finding, one thing that stood out was the lack of a strong connection between keratoconus and altitude.
Altitude? Like how high up you live?
Yeah.
I'm not sure I see the connection to eye health.
It's an interesting one. There's been this theory going around that higher altitudes with their thinner air and increased UV exposure might be linked to higher rates of keratoconus.
I guess that makes sense. But you're saying this study didn't support that theory?
Well, they didn't specifically investigate altitude in their analysis, but they did point out that some previous studies that suggested a link could actually be explained by the fact that humidity decreases as you go higher.
Ah, so it might not be the altitude itself, but rather the lower humidity that often comes with it.
Exactly.
That's really interesting. It's a good reminder that sometimes what appears to be a direct link might actually be influenced by other, less obvious factors.
Yeah, it's all about context.
Absolutely. So all this talk about humidity makes me wonder, if low humidity is a risk factor for keratoconus, could increasing humidity actually be protective? Could it be part of the solution?
Now, that's a fascinating question. And it's definitely an area that needs more research. I mean, if low humidity creates a higher risk environment, it makes sense to explore whether increasing humidity could potentially mitigate that risk.
Right.
It would be really interesting to see if using a humidifier, especially in dry climates, could make a difference.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah.
It would be amazing if something as simple as adding moisture to the air could help protect against keratoconus. But I imagine it's not quite that straightforward. There are probably other factors to consider.
Of course. For example, we need to understand how increasing humidity might interact with other eye conditions. Would a more humid environment potentially worsen other problems? like certain types of infections.
Right.
It's a balancing act.
It always is. Well, it sounds like there are a lot of exciting research avenues to explore here. And those are probably questions best addressed by an eye doctor, who can consider the individual's specific situation.
Absolutely. It's always a good idea to consult with your eye doctor. They can assess your individual risk factors, consider your overall health, and recommend personalized strategies for keeping your eyes healthy.
Great advice.
Hmm.
Knowledge is power, as they say, especially when it comes to our health.
I couldn't agree more.
So this deep dive has definitely left us with more questions than answers, but it has shed some much-needed light on the role that climates, and specifically humidity, might play in keratoconus.
It really has. And it has opened up some exciting new avenues for research and potentially even prevention strategies.
Yeah, this was eye-opening.
I think it's safe to say this is a real turning point in our understanding of this condition.
I love that pun. So before we wrap up, let's recap the key takeaways for our listeners, just to make sure everything is crystal clear.
Sounds good.
I think the biggest takeaway is that humidity plays a much bigger role in keratoconus than we previously thought.
Absolutely. It really challenges some of the existing assumptions about the disease.
And it highlights the importance of keeping our eyes moisturized, especially if we live in drier climates.
Exactly. Simple things like using artificial tears or a humidifier could potentially make a big difference.
Yeah, this research really opened our eyes to a new perspective.
It certainly did. And it underscores how much we still have to learn about keratoconus and other eye conditions.
So what's the next step? Where do we go from here?
Well, for researchers, this study provides a roadmap for future investigations. They can now delve deeper into the mechanisms by which low humidity might affect the cornea and explore potential preventative strategies.
And for the rest of us, the non-scientists.
Talk to your eye doctor. They can assess your individual risk factors, monitor your eye health, and recommend personalized strategies to keep your eyes happy and healthy.
Great advice. Knowledge is power, right?
It really is, especially when it comes to our health.
So before we go, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. You know, if low humidity is a risk factor for keratoconus, could increasing humidity actually be protective? Like for people who already have the condition or are at risk of developing it, could that help?
That's a great question. It's definitely an area that needs more research. You know, it's possible that something as simple as using a humidifier could make a difference for people in dry climates.
Maybe we'll have to revisit this topic in a few years when there's more data.
I'd be happy to.
Well, until then, stay curious, everyone.
And keep learning.
And don't forget to take care of your eyes.
Yes, those peepers are precious.
It sounds like it's time to wrap up this deep dive.
I think so.
All right, folks. Thanks for tuning in. And remember, a little humidity goes a long way. We'll catch you next time on The Deep Dive.